As our last few friends are trickling in, I'll take a second to introduce myself. My name is Olivia. I work in education here at Geva. Thank you so much for joining us for today's prologue for the performance of Frida A Self Portrait, written by and starring Vanessa Severo. I'd like to start by delving into the details of Frida Kahlo's life a little deeper and how she made her own life into art. So let's dive down history lane. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907 as Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderón in Coyoacán, Mexico, to Carl Wilhelm Guillermo Kahlo and Matilda Calderón y González in their home, La Casa Azul, which means in English, the Blue House. In 1904, Frida's father, Guillermo, built La Casa Azul in the colorful Colonia del Carmen district in Coyoacán in Mexico City. The building featured a French-inspired design, and much of Frida's life was shaped by the house. Starting at age 6, she actually spent 9 months recovering in the house when she contracted polio. Frida's bout with polio left her with a limp and one leg more withered than the other. She began wearing extra socks and sometimes the longer, more traditional skirts to hide her polio as she aged. And after Frida recovered, her father encouraged her to take up sports at a very young age. She was incredibly active. She played soccer, she swam, and she even wrestled. He did this also to boost her confidence, as she was often teased for her physical disabilities. La Casa Azul, despite all the time that Frida spent there as a child, was only one of her early influences. She was strongly influenced by the Mexican Revolution in 1910, so much so that later in life she would tell people she was born in the year 1910, rather than the year she was actually born, 1907. The revolution inspired many to take a renewed interest in their Mexican heritage and cultural history, such as folklore and traditional dress, and you'll see some of that in the play. In 1922, Frida entered the National Preparatory School in Mexico City, and she was one of only a few young women to attend at that time. There, she learned how to read in 3 different languages. It was also in that school that she ever first laid eyes on the painter who would change her life. Does anyone want to take a guess who that is? Diego Rivera, yep. He was painting a commission, La Creación, and she would sometimes actually steal his lunch or his paintbrushes and hide them, a sort of typical feisty teenage prank. He didn't actually seem to take much notice of her, despite these pranks at the time, but she said to several of her friends that she thought she would marry him one day. More on that later. In the meantime, she met Alejandro Gomez Arias and fell in love for the first time in her life. When Frida and Alejandro were traveling back to Frida's home after school in 1925 on a bus, they collided with a streetcar. Frida was impaled by a steel handrail in a horrific accident, and while on the street, a passerby took out the handrail before the ambulance could arrive. Alejandro later remarked that Frida's screams were louder than the ambulance's sirens. The doctors did not believe she would live, and Frida spent the rest of her life dealing with major complications from that accident. Unable to do anything physical, Frida needed to do something to combat her loneliness and boredom. She had to lay in bed for a very long time. You'll see some of the diagnoses the doctors gave her laid out in the play. She had planned on actually going into the medical profession before the accident and had had sort of a passing interest in art before. But now she decided to try painting in earnest. She studied the old masters, such as Michelangelo and Da Vinci, and began to teach herself how to paint. As her relationship with Alejandro disintegrated, she painted him in her first known self-portrait in a velvet dress, so that he would remember her. Frida continued to paint through her recovery. And when she recovered, she reconnected with Diego Rivera in 1928 at a party. Diego was actually on his 2nd marriage at the time, and 20 years her senior, yet they were immediately drawn to one another. They married 1 year later in 1929, and she adopted the role of a traditional wife, cooking his meals, running his bath, and dressing in the style that he preferred, traditional Mexican attire. Even in the early part of their marriage, Diego was unable to stay faithful to her. Frida had a difficult time accepting his infidelities and poured her anguish into her art. She was also known to smash some of their ceramic plates to express her anger as well. Diego received highly public commissions, which actually took them to the US for the very first time. On that trip, Frida was noted in newspapers as also being a painter, but was considered cute that such a famous artist as Diego should have a wife who dabbled in a little bit of art herself. During this time in the early 1930s, Frida became pregnant several times, and yet each pregnancy had to be terminated for her own safety. Some doctors believed she would be able to carry a child to term if she had a C-section. During what felt like a healthy pregnancy, unfortunately, Frida miscarried and almost died. Many of her paintings reference her physical and emotional pain over this trauma. If you're noticing a theme, Frida always sought to turn her deepest pain into art, which is part of why she's still so inspirational to this day. Frida insisted that she and Diego return to Mexico. Diego was not thrilled by this and sought the company of other women. Yet he was supremely jealous when Frida began herself taking lovers outside of their marriage. She would try and sometimes succeed in seducing the same women as Diego. But throughout her life, even when she fell in love with someone else, be it a man or a woman, she always returned to him. While back in Mexico, Diego and Frida met surrealist painter Andre Breton, who she felt was a fellow surrealist. However, Frida didn't like being called a surrealist, and she actually said, and I quote, "They thought I was a surrealist, but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." End quote. She didn't really like labels. In 1938, she had her first solo exhibition in New York City at the Julian Levy Gallery to great acclaim. Her relationship with Diego, however, had taken a turn, and they divorced in 1939. Diego was in California that year, and Frida was in Mexico when she began to have major health problems again. A doctor she trusted was in California, and she went to get another opinion. As she recovered and Diego was there, they reconciled, and not 1 year later, they remarried in 1940. In 1942, La Esmeralda, previously known as the Ministry of Public Education School of Painting and Sculpture, opened. And for the first 3 years, Frida taught 3 days a week for 12 hours a day. She loved working with students, and when her health declined too much for her to travel to the school as often, 4 of her students, nicknamed Los Fridos, came to her house to study with her. They were present at the only art exhibition of hers to happen in her lifetime in Mexico in 1953, which she attended in a hospital bed as per her doctor's orders. Frida died in 1954 at La Casa Azul of what was said to be a pulmonary embolism. Following her death, Diego had the house designated as a museum, which is a popular attraction to this day. Has anyone ever been there? Oh, wonderful. Frida died in 1954, but her acclaim for her artwork in her lifetime actually gained more notoriety, as we know, following her death. During the women's liberation movement in the 1960s, many were wondering who were the great women artists and who were the women artists of color, and this sparked what is now known as Frida Mania. In 2016, Frida's 1939 painting, Two Nudes in the Forest, the Earth Itself, sold at Christie's for a record $8 million, the most expensive Latin American art piece sold at auction to date. Diego Rivera may have been known as the founder of the Mexican School of Art, but it's Frida Kahlo who is now more famous for her art, her resilience, and her life. Let's talk a bit about how Frida continues to inspire and this play. Going to La Casa Azul, taking that trip, was actually part of Vanessa Severo's inspiration for this play, as you'll see and hear during the performance. Vanessa saw herself and some of her own challenges represented in Frida's work. Frida was a trailblazer, unabashed in her sexuality, her intelligence, and her vulnerability. Indeed, she poured her life onto the canvas in a way that few other artists have. Her paintings are themselves her unadulterated autobiography. Vanessa has been performing Frida A Self Portrait since 2019, and it has been seen in theaters around the country, from Kansas City Rep to Portland Center Stage, Cincinnati Playhouse, most recently in Pittsburgh at the Public Theater, and next year it will be going to the Indiana Repertory Theater. Reviewers have called Vanessa's performance an athletic feat, something we like to think might have amused Frida, given that she herself was an athlete at such a young age. Behind me, you might be wondering, you'll see the beautiful set designed by Jacqueline Penrod for all of the productions of Frida that have traveled around the country. It is the year of clotheslines at Geva. Did anyone here see The Wizard of Oz? Yep, we've had a lot of clothes on stage so far this year. So keep an eye on the inventive way that Vanessa uses them during the performance as storytelling tools themselves. I want to draw your attention, though, to the ceiling piece and these broken posts. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what they might represent?
Her bed.
Her bed. Yeah, we had a couple people jump in. In Frida's life, she had approximately 30 operations due to the trolley accident and her other health challenges like polio. And she often wound up bedridden for long periods of time, up to 2 years at one point. So those pieces are a poetic interpretation of that experience in her life. She actually would paint from lying down on her bed. So this set piece sort of pushes that out and invites you into that part of her history. As you're watching, try to catch how both the broken bed and the clothesline may symbolically connect to represent Frida's physical situation. Before I leave you, or before I open it up for questions, I want to give you 2 quotes about Frida and her work. The first is from her husband, Diego, in a letter he wrote to Pablo Picasso. The quote is, "I recommend Frida to you, not as a husband, but as an enthusiastic admirer of her work. Acid and tender, hard as steel, delicate and fine as a butterfly's wing, lovable as a beautiful smile, and profound and cruel as the bitterness of life." The second is from Karen Carbo in her essay, The Inconvenient Spectacle of Frida Kahlo, in the book In Praise of Difficult Women. The quote is, "Frida wasn't about to suffer in silence. She wasn't interested so much in communicating her situation as expressing it. This is how it feels to be in the broken female body. This is how it feels to be alone and without my beloved. This is how it feels to be me. I dare you to look, and once you look, I'm going to make sure you cannot look away." End quote. All right, we have a good amount of time for questions. Anyone want to start us off? And we have some students here, so I'm looking at you. You're used to raising your hand. Are you from an art class? Oh, wonderful. Welcome. Yeah.
At what point in the marriage, divorce, remarriage, was his nameless affair with her sister?
You'll see that moment actually in the play. Oh gosh, this is like a pop quiz for me. I believe the divorce came after the affair with her sister. They had been, and what you'll see in this play is that Frida, that broke Frida's heart, that affair, rightly so. And that spurred on another round of infidelity between the two of them and her exploration of other lovers. She had many. And many, if you look outside, we have photographs from Nicholas Morai of Frida Kahlo, a really special collection that Geva's gained access to through the George Eastman House. He was one of her lovers, and he photographed her in a way that I don't think many people ever had. She always depicted herself, and this time she was depicted through someone else's lens. So I recommend looking at those. Good question, thank you. Anyone else? Yes?
Just a comment. I appreciate that you mentioned her pansexuality.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you that don't know, pansexuality is that you're comfortable with having sex or actually compatibility.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. It was a big part of who she was. She was a
But
trailblazer.
Very seldom mentioned, so kudos.
Absolutely. Well, and I think you'll enjoy this play too, because I think one of the reasons why we love this play so much, and I know you will, is Vanessa just explores such a holistic look of who Frida was, and then brings in her own personal experiences as well. But she does it in the same way as Frida, just unabashedly, unapologetically. She's just saying, this is who this woman was, and you get to watch. And that's a big part of Frida's life. Absolutely. Anyone else? Yeah.
So she traveled to other places, correct? To work?
Yeah,
Did you repeat the question?
absolutely. So the question was, Frida traveled to other places throughout her life. For most of her life, really up until the very end, she only traveled to travel with Diego and his commissions all over the world. So he was commissioned in San Francisco, New York, I believe Detroit, but don't quote me on that one. But he can be seen all over the US and Mexico. And so she traveled with him, and it was true that people would say, like, his little lady who paints a little bit herself. You know, she was not known as the massive, famous artist that we know her as today. So the exhibit I mentioned in New York was one of the only where she traveled to present her own work. Otherwise, it was all for Diego. But the travel really did inspire her as well. It was there's a great book about Frida's experience and awakening in her trip to New York City. I believe we have it outside, actually. It very much informed her work, though. Yes.
Is she held in high acclaim in Mexico today?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Frida's house, La Casa Azul, is one of the most popular tourist destinations. It's just huge as a museum, and she's huge everywhere, I think, but especially Mexico because that's where she's from. Yeah. Frida mania stretches across the globe. Yes. Sure. So the question was, can I speak to Frida and Diego's worldview and politics? Absolutely. Another great pop quiz question for me that I don't know how well I can answer personally. I recommend everyone looking into that themselves. I know that they were a big part of, Frida very closely aligned herself with the Mexican Revolution in faking her birth date to be the year that it started instead of the year she was actually born. And they were both very politically active, going to rallies and engaging in the community and being a part of the community of artists who were putting, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. They were not afraid, Diego and Frida, to be controversial in a way that I think was very inspiring. But their specific politics, I know I need to read more about. I've always focused more on her artwork, and that's a huge other part of her history. So thank you for bringing that up. And I recommend everyone looks into it as well. Yes?
So there's a wonderful documentary, a 3-part documentary that you can access on WXXI Passport.
Mm-hmm.
And they do look at their politics. And
Oh,
the fact
great.
that they actually house Lenin in their home.
Yes.
Trustee.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So there is a 3-part documentary, I believe produced by PBS, that you can watch on WXXI, where they talk a lot about Frida's politics and her relationship with Diego, and the two of them and their political involvement. And Leon Trotsky was brought up, who actually is in many famous photographs with Frida. They were very close friends, she, Diego, and Leon Trotsky. So definitely check that out. I know it's been on my list. I also recommend the movie with Salma Hayek, the Frida biopic, that was directed by Julie Taymor, who people might know directed The Lion King on Broadway, so it's a very theatrical movie, best of both worlds. And that definitely goes into some of Frida's political explorations when she's younger too. You'll see depicted dramatically in that as well. Thank you for bringing that up.
And a lot of Diego's work is very clearly worker,
Yes.
workers' rights, labor.
Yep, workers' rights. You can see that in Diego's murals. Thank you, yes. All right, we probably have time for one more very quick question, and then I have to get you on your way. Oh, never mind, I'm getting a signal. Thank you all so much for joining. This is great questions. Please check out the art outside, and we just ask that you return to our lobby so we can finish setting some things up on stage, and then the house management team will let you know when to come back in. Thank you so much.